Sherrod Brown is officially running to reclaim his U.S. Senate seat in 2026. That makes the race against Senator Jon Husted, who was appointed to the seat earlier this year after serving as lieutenant governor, a national one. Democrats are hoping Brown can help them retake the majority in the Senate. But Brown and his party's path to victory won't be easy. Kyle Kondik is managing editor for Sabato's Crystal Ball, a nonpartisan newsletter put out by the University of Virginia's Center for Politics. Kyle, welcome back to CTW.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start by asking you, you have moved this race from likely Republican to lean Republican. Why?
Look, I mean, Sherrod Brown gives the Democrats a real candidate in this race. It wasn't necessarily clear that they were going to have a real candidate against Jon Husted, who was, as you said, appointed to the Senate seat to take over for now Vice President J.D. Vance. And so I think that Brown running does increase the odds of Democrats being able to win this race, but I still think that Husted is probably favored to start, and then we'll see where this thing goes. I mean, to me, the biggest factor in this race is something that I think is kind of outside the hands of the two candidates, in that what does the political environment look like in November 2026? You know, if it's like 2018 or 2006, which were Democratic wave years that Sherrod Brown won Senate races in Ohio, Brown probably would have a decent chance to win. But if it's something less than that, then I think his path becomes a lot tougher.
This is not the marquee race, so to speak, on the ballot. That's going to be the governor's race. Brown has outperformed Democrats before, depending on who's at the top of any given ticket for a presidential or gubernatorial race. What do you think, though, that race could mean for the performance of both candidates, Husted and Brown?
The governor's race may take place on a totally different track than the Senate race, and we saw this in the last two kind of big statewide years in 2018 in Ohio in 2018 and 2022. In that, in 2018, Sherrod Brown won re-election by 6.5, 7 points, whereas the rest of the statewide races, the Republicans won by like 3 to 6 points. So there was a huge difference between the Senate race and the other statewide elected offices, governor and the other statewide elected officials. And then in 2022, the Senate race that J.D. Vance won over Tim Ryan, Vance won by roughly 6 points, whereas the other statewide races were blowouts. And so it's possible that the Senate race will look a lot different than the other statewide races.
I wanted to ask you about money, Kyle, because Brown is coming off the most expensive Senate campaign in U.S. history. Is there an opportunity for that to be the case in this race, even though it's just for a 2-year period?
Yeah, look, I think there's probably going to be money flowing in on both sides in this race, because if Democrats have any chance to win the Senate, they probably have to win this race, because the way the map shakes out is there are competitive races on both sides, but the Democrats would need to net 4 Senate seats to actually get to 51 seats and win an outright Senate majority. If it's 50-50, Republicans effectively still have control because Vice President Vance breaks ties. Of the seats the Republicans are defending, one of them is Susan Collins in Maine, who's the only Republican who holds a seat in a state that Kamala Harris won for president. And then there's open seat in North Carolina, which is a very competitive but kind of slightly Republican-leaning state. Other than that, all of the states that Republicans are defending in the Senate are states that Donald Trump won by 10 points or more at the presidential level. So the Democrats would have to flip at least a couple of seats that were pretty hostile to them in the last presidential election. And Ohio sort of stands out just because it has had competitive Senate races in recent years, and Brown is a proven candidate, although one who just lost in 2024. So if in fact the Senate majority is really in play in fall of 2026, Ohio would probably would have to be at the center of that. Now, if you're Republican, you look at it and say, hey, Ohio's a Republican-leaning state. It's much more Republican-leaning than it was, 10 years ago. And so that gives them some cushion in the fight for the Senate.
I want to ask you, Kyle, about redistricting, because that's going to be a factor here in Ohio when the General Assembly comes back. They're going to have to draw up maps by November. Their maps are legally have to occur because of the lack of any sort of consensus on the first set of maps. So it isn't this what's happening in Texas or in California, and yet it's just as impactful.
Yeah, the Ohio redistricting fight is going to be something that happens in the fall. It's really important, and Ohio's a little bit different than some of these other states in that Ohio was the one state we knew was going to have a new congressional map for 2026 because of Ohio's kind of convoluted redistricting system. The current map is sunsetting for 2026, and the thing that's different now compared to the 2021 and 2022 battle over the current map is that the composition of the state Supreme Court, which kind of acts as a sort of a backstop in this process to try to enforce some of basically the kind of the fairness rules that were written into the state constitution by voters last decade. The current court is basically friendlier to Republicans than the court was back in 2022. And so presumably that means that Republicans can go further on this map than they did in 2022. The current map is like, it's not a quote unquote, fair nonpartisan map, but it's kind of a leaning Republican map in that it benefits Republicans, but there are some constraints on it. What Republicans might be able to do now is to sort of remove some of those constraints. And so what might that mean? Well, Democrat Amelia Sykes in the Akron-Canton area, Democrat Marcy Kaptur in Toledo, they might find themselves in seats that are more hostile to them. And then the bigger question is whether Republicans also try to go after Greg Landsman in Cincinnati, because you could, that's a more Democratic-leaning seat than the other two I mentioned. You could, under the rules, kind of cut up Southwest Ohio in a more dramatic way to try to target him. It's unclear to me as to whether Republicans are going to want to do that, but there's also a lot of pressure coming from the White House to Republican states all over the country to try to maximize their number of seats. We've seen that in Texas. We might see that in Missouri and Indiana, and maybe we'll see that in Ohio too. So that's something to watch here this fall.
Kyle Kondik, managing editor for the Sabato's Crystal Ball, a nonpartisan newsletter out of the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Kyle, always good to see you. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage. And click the subscribe button here. You can also download our app and watch us on TV to learn more about the candidates, where they stand on the issues, and more. We'll see you then.